terms of what I'm presenting tonight, when I was asked to pick a topic or essentially focus on something like leadership, leadership is such a 100,000 foot in the air topic these days. It can mean anything, and it can mean a lot of negative things at the same time. And I thought to myself, well, how can I make it relevant to what we're trying to accomplish at TechElec, and also, more importantly, what any technology company is trying to accomplish. One thing that leadership it's a necessary but not a sufficient ingredient to actually having a successful technology company. The other key ingredient, I think, is creativity. And I'll get into what I mean by that. We have this connotation that engineers are very logical thinkers, great at math and science, et cetera, with absolutely no creative or artistic aspect to what they do. Nothing could be further from the truth. If I look at the successes and the failures over the last 20 years that I've been involved in, the ones that were successful very clearly had very creative leaders who thought differently and changed the way they actually got through their day-to-day activities and actually delivered a product. And that is really the key differentiator between just taking something and making it more efficient, in other words, managing something, and then taking something and adding some creative thought to it and leading a team to a new direction or to a new objective. And I'm going to give you some specific examples that show this in action at TechElec, and also some other examples of what I've gathered over the years, both good and bad, on what I learned and how leadership and creativity really work hand in hand to create a successful technology company. Very basic definition: a capability given by the practical application of knowledge. The practical application of knowledge is true, but that knowledge in the first place comes from a creative process within somebody's brain. That creative process is really what the differentiation is that leads to that practical application. Let's talk about TechElec for a couple of slides. And this is meant to just give you a background of what we do and who we are. And then I'm going to draw from that and continue with this theme of leadership and creativity. Who are we? Well, we're based in North Carolina, and as the slide says, we are in the telecommunications equipment business. We are the #1 market share owner of a very small niche market within the telecom equipment sector. That's actually not a bad thing. That niche is defined in about a couple of $2 billion worth of revenue or CapEx spending per year by service providers. So we play in about a $2 billion niche, but we're clearly #1. We have roughly about 80% of the US market share in what we do, and about 40% in global market share. Now, what do we do? So here comes the more complicated process. It's actually quite difficult to understand what we do, but I think the easiest way to explain it is we actually build the platform that takes the numbering or address part of a phone call or an internet session and makes that connection to the other side. For example, you take out your cell phone, you dial 10 numbers, 919 something. That part of the call that has the numbers in it goes through our equipment. And whether or not you are an AT&T Mobile subscriber or a Verizon subscriber or a T-Mobile subscriber, it all goes through TechElec equipment. 100% of those calls go through our equipment. That's the niche that we own. And that's called signaling processing. So an STP, signal transfer point, is what makes that happen. The rest of the call gets carried through a router or a switch, and that's the actual media, your voice, the message you're sending. That's what we do in a nutshell. Now, there's a lot more complexity to that. We do it very well. We have #1 market share. And one of the reasons we do it so well was because of the creative thinking of a few designers about 16 years ago that actually invented the product. More in a minute on that. We're headquartered here in Morrisville. That's just smack dab in Research Triangle Park. For those of you not from this area, it's a very tiny town. But it's Research Triangle Park. 650 employees down the road. We have a pretty good-sized campus. About 950 employees globally. That's all. We're listed on NASDAQ. We have about $1 billion, just under $1 billion market cap, and we've been on NASDAQ since 1986. So we've been around for a while, and we've seen a few boom and bust cycles in telecom equipment. This is our list of customers. Not going to test your knowledge of customers or your eyesight. This is on our website. The only reason I want to put up this chart is, although we're based here and 2/3 of our employees are in Morrisville, North Carolina, over half our revenues come from outside the U.S. So our ability to take our products internationally is really the only thing that's allowing us to continue growing. Once you've got 80% market share of something, it's tough to grow. It's a great problem to have, but it's tough to grow. So our growth has been internationally. And this just shows the amount of activity on a global basis that all of us literally drive by every day and don't even realize. So those 650 people in Morrisville actually take care of all that and deal with problems from Pakistan to Nigeria to Brazil to India to China to all these other countries on a day-to-day basis. So now let's get back to the theme of creativity and leadership as two essential ingredients for success in technology. A leader's ability to guide the creative process is behind every technical breakthrough and fundamental to a company's success. That's the point I was making earlier. Unless that leader can draw the creative aspect out of their team, there really won't be a breakthrough. You can easily tell people what to do and have them follow your directions, just like a recipe. That won't lead to any breakthroughs. In fact, unless you have a monopoly, it'll actually lead to decreasing value over time because your competition's going to figure out how to do it better. So that creativity is really what keeps you competitive and keeps you growing. And in technology, as you well know, if you don't grow, you become yesterday's news in a hurry. Gaining the knowledge and the leadership skills to motivate a team to creatively invent has no playbook. There isn't. There are so many courses out there for leadership. Please take your time in evaluating what their claims are. Most of that, I think, is, without being unkind, most of it's garbage. And the reason it is leadership really comes through knowledge and experience, through doing it over and over, failing, succeeding, doing it over and over, and eventually getting to that end game. It's very difficult to teach leadership. It's very, very difficult to learn leadership skills. And you can just apply that logic to your day-to-day life. Have you ever noticed there's certain people, they walk into a room, there's a natural affinity? Why is that? Is that natural-born leadership, or is that just charisma? And once you get into the surface, or behind the surface, you realize maybe it is just charisma. And behind every leader is not necessarily great charisma. Could be behind every politician, but not necessarily every leader. Have you also noticed, in contrast to that, when somebody who's been incredibly successful, has started many companies, is at the top of their game, has patents to their names, is a PhD, but they come into the room, nobody notices who they are. They could easily just be a leader as well. The point I'm making is it's really the knowledge and the application of that knowledge and the depth of experience that determines leadership, not necessarily some quick 30-second soundbite or something that somebody notices and all of a sudden there's this moniker that's attached to an individual that they're a born leader. Also, leadership is not an attribute that is constant throughout your lifetime. I'm always a little skeptical when I see a resume of someone who's been class president since 5th grade and done everything at the top of the game, has never had any kind of downside. They've always been a leader their entire life. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that person really doesn't know how to follow. And that's a skill that's required. To be a great leader, you got to know at one point in your life how to follow. And those are some of the themes that I'm going to get into a little bit later. But again, at the end of the day, there is no recipe. There's no playbook. Leaders come in all shapes and sizes. And in many times, it's the opportunity that makes the leader, because that opportunity does map into what that leader's experience base is at that time. If it were given a different opportunity at that given point in time, maybe that experience base was not applicable and that leadership opportunity was lost. Predicting the future. How difficult this truly is. And I want to give you a few examples from a technology perspective on how difficult it is to predict the future, therefore how difficult it is to just say, I'm going to lead you to that promised land, because it's so hard to do. It's just a series of steps, a series of missteps, and unless you go through the full process of understanding how to get from one point to the other, it really is difficult to reach that end point of success. So let's go through some technical examples or technology examples. Telephone. Graham Bell inventing the telephone. And if you read the story in summary form, you would think that AT&T and the phone network was created the next day. It took 30 years before somebody figured out that, hey, you know what? People want to talk to each other. Maybe we can use this telephone to do that. The telephone was actually invented to replace the telegraph. It actually didn't replace the telegraph for probably over 100 years after it was invented. In fact, true story, in 1985, my first job with Price Waterhouse in Toronto, I was in the auditing group of Price Waterhouse, and one of my jobs was to get a telegraph assurance of the accounts receivable balance from overseas companies. 1985, they were still using telegraph notices. The point I'm making is we don't always know what the technology is needed for. So it's creative to invent something, and then the leadership comes in terms of what you do with it. Again, creativity and leadership, both ingredients completely necessary for success. This is actually quite interesting. It took 30 years to figure out that a phone system was something that people wanted and would willingly pay for. Another good example of this was the original wireless capabilities, the original cell phone. And I remember this clearly. In the early 80s, AT&T came out with a study that said, in their estimation, if everything goes right, there will be 1 million wireless phone subscribers by the year 2000. They were adamant, and they, as a result, did not go out and buy spectrum for wireless. So a bad business decision, leading from pretty well a bad call on predicting the future. It's so hard to predict the future. They actually got it right. They just missed a few zeros. There were 1 billion subscribers by the year 2000, not 1 million. Now there's 2.4 billion 7 years later. So they missed that one. And ironically now, AT&T is still the big dog in wireless because their baby Bell offspring started buying each other, and eventually SBC bought everybody and changed their name back to AT&T. And there's a hilarious Stephen Colbert clip on YouTube that actually goes through that whole history. It's pretty funny. But again, very, very difficult to predict that technology and what the usage would be. Email, another good example. That was invented by the folks at ARPANET. And they were adamant that you only needed communications between machines. Why would people ever use email, electronic mail, to talk to each other? A radical concept. People wanted to actually share information on an instantaneous basis. Now, I have 2 teenagers. They do remind me that the only time they use email is to communicate with older people because everybody knows it's text messaging and IM now. So even email has become kind of outdated. But in 1967, nobody thought email was going to be big, and they missed it. One interesting aspect to this, we talked about the 30 years telephone example. 1967 was when email was sort of invented. That was the first killer application for the internet, and the internet boom started roughly when? Late 90s, kind of 30 years later. So there was a lot of nurturing, there's a lot of gestation period for good technology. The reason for that is the creativity part was there. The leadership in terms of applying business models and taking that technology to that next level was not, that takes time, it took some time, and it always does. Interesting to sit here now and ask what inventions are being invented now that are going to be big in 30 years. And we ask ourselves, are we completely missing something right now? We probably are. There's probably hundreds that are going to be huge in 30 years, and you think, wow, why didn't I think of that in 2007? Text messaging. Another invention, very creative in terms of sending text between cell phones, but never intended to do what it does today. The intention originally for text messaging was for diagnostics, for people to send messages across networks to tell them how well that network was working. What people didn't realize, and this is, again, technology, not for technology's sake, but this is technology needing some creative aspect to it to make it better. The creative aspect part of it had nothing to do with technology. It was simply recognizing that cell phone calls are often not private because you're in a crowd when you're talking, so people hear at least one side of your conversation, and you needed something a little bit more private to send between parties. Another aspect of it is teenagers, kids, typically the demographic that uses most text messaging, or at least consumes most text messaging, everything to them is a secret, and they want to share it. You remember passing notes? Well, this is the new notes. So kids that are 10 feet apart from each other will send text messages to each other. All of you that have teenagers, you know that. You've seen the bills, and you've all run to the cellular store and put them on an all-you-can-eat plan. That's right. Because you got that $400 bill. It happened to me. But again, this is technology, creativity added to it, and then leadership taken it to that next level. SMS, or text messaging, is near and dear to our heart at Tekelec. I talked about that call connection aspect of our products. Every SMS or text message that gets sent through wireless networks goes through our equipment. So I can't be too harsh to my children for using a lot of text messaging. That's very good, and you should encourage it. The impact of new technologies. So we talked about the impact of the telephone and the email invention by ARPANET, text messaging. The impact was not immediate. In fact, it wasn't even known. Eventually became massive. So risk-taking, effective leadership, and that creativity drive the adoption of new technology. And that adoption also requires a very sound business model, or else you really don't create any new value from it. Back to Tekelec. The first Eagle was actually landed, Eagle is our brand name for our product, in Concord, North Carolina. So Concord, North Carolina, Concord Telephone Company, to be exact, was the first customer of the Eagle product that Tekelec sold in 1991. Why do I use this as an example? In 1991, and this is 5 years after Tekelec became public, Tekelec at that time was a test and measurement company. The only products they made tested or measured the aspects of the network or how certain elements in the network were working. They really weren't in the networking business. But a few very, very creative designers thought that the entire phone system was becoming unwieldy because all of the permutations and combinations of numbers had to be put on each individual switch, and calling connections took longer and longer. And there was a danger that you would pick up the phone and you wouldn't get dial tone. We always just assumed it was always there. If the switches were overloaded, you wouldn't get dial tone. So they wanted to figure out a way that they can at least connect the call take that traffic away, make the call connection very quickly, and then carry the media through the switching fabric in the network. And they came up with something called a signal transfer point, an STP, which to this day is still the heart of Tecolec's business. They came up with this even though the company was running out of cash. A lot of people in the company were telling them they were crazy because, you know, what's a standalone STP? All that functionality is all built into the switch. Why do you want to try to do it standalone? So there were a lot of naysayers saying you can't do this. But that one group of designers pushed it through. And why? They believed in the endpoint. They believed in the fact that that technology would work. They led the rest of the company in understanding that this was a good thing for the company to do. And they were very creative in looking at a problem and solving it in a very different way. Solving it in a way that nobody had ever attempted. By the way, at the time, they were dealing with multi-billion-dollar competitors, AT&T, which later became Lucent, Nortel, Ericsson, Siemens, all of these multi-billion-dollar multinationals, and then tiny Tecolec, who literally at that time was having trouble making payroll, came through and did it, and eventually got 80% market share of that market. So that was a good example of all these ingredients coming together and creating some success. Concord, for those of you who don't know where that is, it's where the big mall is, just so. Global number portability success. So what did Tecolec do beyond Eagle? So now that Tecolec had that market share, they decided to go into other markets that very naturally took advantage of those same skills and created leadership by being creative and reusing the base core competencies of the original product. In this case, database management. It's probably the easiest way to describe it. So because the STP already essentially manages all these call connections, it has real-time processing capabilities, and it has incredible scalability to do it, you know, literally millions of transactions per second. So if you can do that, well, what other problems can you solve? Number portability is essentially, and all of you know what it is, if you start with Sprint and you want to change carriers and you want to go to AT&T Mobility, you want to port that same number to that new network. Well, there's a piece of technology that has to allow that to happen because every cell phone is homed to a particular network. In our case, that number portability software is provided by Tecolec. And it was a way to creatively solve a problem. The FCC was mandating number portability. Solve it by reusing some of the elements of the base product. From that early US success now, as you can see, many countries around the world have standardized on that Tecolec number portability software. So establishing effective leadership, creativity. Without that very clear thinking and without that new idea, nothing happens. So essential ingredient number one. And then the rest of the slide, as I build it up, are all aspects of leadership. Leadership is not something that's very easily defined. It really is a series of attributes that define leadership. Commitment and dedication. Leadership, again, is not born. It's a lot of trial and error. We like to simplify things the way Saturday morning, 1-minute snippets do it. For example, Isaac Newton sitting under a tree and the apple falling, and all of a sudden, gravity comes to mind. And Ben Franklin flying a kite, and all of a sudden electricity is the result. It didn't happen that way. There were years and years of study and questioning and trial and error, and anybody that's obviously in engineering knows the scientific method and poring over things and knows there's a lot of failures before you actually have that single success. That's all part of leadership. And it never comes easy. If it does, you're lucky. It's just luck. It really usually does come from a lot of hard work and a lot of trial and error. Customer focus. If it's applied towards a company or trying to establish a business model or a successful company, you've got to understand exactly what the business issues and the business problems your customer is facing. If you don't have a very clear understanding as to how your customer is making money and makes a profit, you likely won't be successful. Depth of knowledge and expertise. Back to my comments about it being very difficult for somebody to just be a born leader. It really comes from a series of experiences, a lot of things that they've done both career-wise and in their lives, the way they interact with people. There's a whole bunch of attributes that have to come together before you could be considered a great leader. And it's one of those things that it's recognized when it's there, but don't fall into the trap that it's something that is natural and can't be worked on. It's not something that you can easily train somebody to be. You can't go through a 3-month training session and become a great leader. But it's certainly something you can learn about in terms of what are the attributes that you have to have and the years, literally, it will take for you to get there. Focus on execution. There has to be discipline in what your end game is. Although it takes a long time, you do have to tell yourself, you know, I'm going to give myself a certain amount. And this is more towards the commercial aspects of commercializing technology. You have to tell yourself there's an end game, and there's going to be a point where you're going to say, this is just not going to work. It's good science or it's good technology, but it's just not going to be commercialized. Now, usually that's done for you because you run out of money. But in a lot of cases, people do try for too long to go through a process where, you know, they're trying to reach almost the holy grail of a particular way of doing something. I've seen this a lot in networking, for example, with people trying to apply new ideas and really taking too long, taking 10, 15 years and not quite getting there. And then teamwork. All of the examples I gave, whether they were Techelec specific or all of those other examples, they weren't done by an individual. They were necessarily done by a team. And that's not necessarily a team that one individual put together. A lot of times it's a team that comes together because there's a common need. How you get that team to work together towards that common purpose is really the challenge of the leader. And a true leader tries to get people on the team that are a lot smarter than they are. And if they try to get people on the team that just reflect what they do or just agree with what they do, they will typically fail. So teamwork really means having that honest look on what your own deficiencies are as an individual and as a leader, and seeing how you can fill those gaps by attracting people that are not in your image and are clearly bringing something to the table that you can't. And by the way, that's how you accelerate the experience gaps. I talked about having all this experience needed to be a great leader. One way to accelerate it is surround yourself with people who have the experience that you don't. So putting all that together, creativity, execution, customer-focused leadership, you know, eventually that struggle to make payroll in 1991 led to almost $1 billion market cap. A lot of work happened between 1991 and now. A lot of people's efforts went into this. But I think, you know, the important aspect or the important point I want to leave you with is all of these ingredients were essential, in particular creativity and the rest, which are aspects of leadership. So I'm going to finish it right there and save the next 25 minutes or so for Q&A. When I was at Warburg Pincus, the company Warburg had invested in a company by the name of Proxim. It was a publicly traded company. And at the time, Proxim was undergoing a dispute over intellectual property with another company by the name of Symbol. And this litigation had been hanging around for years, I think for about 4 years, and everybody was suing each other in the industry. This all had to do with base technology and how you actually bounce radio frequencies back and forth in a Wi-Fi type setting. So some basic fundamental technology to making a Wi-Fi or an in-building wireless network work. So Proxim started the war and sued everybody because they thought they had the killer patents. Symbol sued back. The case went to trial. The first couple of weeks, the original trial, Proxim suing Symbol, got in front of the jury, and the jury said, no, Symbol didn't violate the patents or didn't infringe on the patents. In the second week, they reversed roles, and they obviously made their arguments, and Proxim lost. And the jury awarded Symbol 6% of revenues going back to 1994 and 6% of revenues going forward. Now, if any of you are in that Wi-Fi game, you know 6% of revenues when your margins are 25, 30%, that's kind of going out of business. You can't withstand that blow. So what happened at that point was, and this is when I was CEO of Proxim, we had to completely retrench the business and almost start from scratch and redefine it. And eventually, we decided that we couldn't do it and had to go into Chapter 11 and sell the assets. And the reason we went into Chapter 11 was the nice thing about litigation, the only thing about litigation is you're an unsecured creditor when you win in litigation. So you can use the bankruptcy courts to take that all off and then sell the assets to whoever wants to buy the assets. It was purely a financial play, but the pain of going through this when you're managing a couple hundred employees who all of a sudden, have at least no near future in their mind with that company was very, very difficult. So definitely a failure in the sense of trying to create something, trying to take it to the next level, and then just getting whacked by something that had been kind of hanging around in the past. Other failures in technology, I tell you, there's failures every day. While you're inventing a product, things catch fire. There's tons of bugs in software, and the whole thing crunches down. It is one of the least predictable processes out there. And the irony of it all is it's supposed to be the one that follows logic the best. Software should be logical, and there should be a nice symmetry to it. Well, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Hardware, which is also a very, very difficult thing in technology because we're trying to squeeze more and more capabilities into a smaller and smaller footprint. You have all these very basic laws of physics that you start running up against. Heat dissipation and all these other issues. There's a lot of failures. And I remember one back in the Nortel days. There was a product that I eventually became the general manager of this product. It became wildly successful well before I got there. But this product, this DMS-10 it was called, it was a digital switch. It was the first digital switch on the market, and it was introduced in 1977. And it was funny because, with huge fanfare, this Canadian company that nobody had ever heard of, and back then it was called Northern Electric, was coming down to the U.S. and presenting to all the non-AT&T companies. Back then, there was Continental Tel and all these GTE companies that nobody in this room has even heard of unless they're in the business. And they were presenting this new digital switch because it was going to be a breakthrough. 2 hours before they were going to present this, they were doing a trial run, and they had powered it up, and it caught fire. So there was a lot of scrambling behind that curtain to make sure that the curtain didn't go up and there was just a bunch of ashes. But that's how close failure is to success, and how we're always walking that fine line in technology. And frankly, I think that's what makes it exciting. Technology is one of those things that you can make a tremendous breakthrough and change literally the way people talk to each other or the way they conduct business overnight. But you can also, by the next person that's working on something down the road, you can be obsolete overnight as well. And you're always having to do that kind of very fine line of walking to not be complacent and not think that you're the best and nobody else can catch up. The question is, how do you promote and cultivate leadership at all levels in the organization? It's fundamentally, you have got to let people make decisions and let them pass or fail with them. Now, obviously, you don't want them making decisions to the point where the company is really harmed. But I think it's that matter of trust and letting people really go out and take risks without the repercussion or the fear of repercussion being always in their mind. If you've got that fear of repercussion, typically you will have a very risk-averse organization. So walking that fine line is really all about understanding how much leeway to give for those decisions and allowing people to grow with them. I know I've benefited tremendously by having mentors that allowed me to go out and run the department or run the business the way I saw fit, and they were very supportive of it. And even if I came in with radical ideas, they would shoot them down and not shoot them down in a way where they'd say, forget it, that would never happen, I don't want things done that way. They would shoot them down in a way to say, well, have you tried this, this, or this? You shoot them down in a very constructive way and send people back out. The other thing that I would encourage at an individual level, so that's the management's kind of perspective. On an individual level, push yourself to get out of your comfort zone. I've seen so many people get cynical and grumble because they don't get promoted. And then when you ask them, well, what have you done that really is different than what you've done over the last 2 or 3 years? Well, I've done this job and I really improved it and it's fantastic and this is the best department you've ever seen in this particular area. I said, well, what about beyond that? What you've done is you've really created a very narrow path for yourself where you can only be the manager of that department. What have you done to get yourself out of that comfort zone? Push yourself to something that clearly you have a good chance to fail at, but clearly if you are successful, you gain essentially a few years of progress because your experience base goes from here to here. That is, and for people that are just starting their career, that is the toughest thing for people to embark upon because they're just getting started, they're making a good salary, they're about to pick up a mortgage and they got a nice car, just kind of taking that risk. Entrepreneurs do that very naturally. They roll the dice, they're out there, they do it. People in big companies tend not to do that. And in fact, they don't want to do that, and one of the reasons they go to a big company is because of that. So even within a big company, force yourself to do that because you've got the big company safety net, it's great. Or take a shot at a startup. Do it early in your career. I have all the respect in the world when I see a resume of people that have gone through startups early in their career. It's tremendous experience, even if they failed miserably. Tremendous learning experience. Because in a startup, you've seen all aspects of the company that you don't really necessarily see in a bigger company. You've seen sales, you've seen marketing, you've seen R&D, you've seen technology, you've seen customers, you've seen things that work, things that fail. That's a great experience base. So I would encourage you to do that. And if you are willing to do that, you're well on your way to becoming a very natural leader because you're going to have more experience than the next person. In my case, I'll just give you some examples. I was very lucky to do a lot of international experience early in my career. And that was rare in the 80s. There weren't a lot of people willing to go overseas and spend a year in France or spend a year in Latin America learning how business is done there. I did that not knowing at the time that that would pay dividends later on. It did, because as US-based companies became a lot more multinational and global, that skill set was required. So go out and try to figure out what you think is going to be hot in 5-10 years and try to do that. Mandarin classes are probably pretty good these days. So there is a massive skill set training effort that goes along with that. And you do it one team at a time. And if you look at it, and Doug Suriano, who runs our R&D efforts here, Doug's day-to-day life is almost like, is half technology and half master planner with spreadsheets that move bodies and effort from one effort to the next, or one project to the next, defining everything right down to the man week, how much it's going to take, what kind of skill sets you need. You literally have to track almost every individual and say, here's what we need to do within the next 18 months. Here are the people we need to train and have ready to do this type of work over the next 18 months because this is our rollout of products. And here's how we're going to increase our bandwidth by using some external partners. So we're mixing and matching all of this as we go along because there's going to be pieces of work that we want to turn on and turn off because it takes 3 months. We typically use outside resources for that. Internally, we know we need to have a core set of skills that need to be there for the next 10, 15 years. And we train those people with that higher level of knowledge and that higher level of capability. And we constantly put them through a new training regiment to learn the new stuff. Now, the good news is engineers are typically very, very curious and knowledge-thirsty people. So we really don't have to encourage them to go do the new stuff. They want to do that. In fact, our bigger challenge is keeping the guys minding the store to sell the current stuff long enough before they jump to the new stuff, because they really do want to do the new stuff, and that's good. I mean, and that's the part of a typical engineer's personality that's very easy to work with. So the question is teamwork. Is it more collaboration or consensus? I'll add another aspect to it. You need to have some persuasive decision-making in that mix. Consensus without a deadline or without a clear owner or accountable individual doesn't work. And the reason for that is you typically take too long to make a decision, and once a decision is made, it's typically it's the path of least resistance. You don't really make the breakthroughs when you do pure consensus-type management or consensus-type leadership. I also believe that if there's an organization that really just runs on purely consensus terms, meaning everybody has to agree, then you compromise things to death to the point where they're kind of useless. Kind of like the way our governments run. A lot of consensus. So interest groups all take their little pieces, and you're left with something that not everybody really agrees with, and it's almost watered down to the point where somebody that could have made a decision would have upset one group or another, but maybe for the greater good would have been better. In a corporation, you don't have the luxury of a lot of time, and you don't have a luxury of a paying customer that is stuck with you. They have choices. So you've got to make decisions. You've got to be clear. And I think the collaboration part of it, when it involves your suppliers and customers, is very, very important. You get their input, but then you've got to be clear on your decision. Even if it turns out to be wrong and you need to tweak it, it's better to make that clear decision and take that path. Waiting too long to make it is a dangerous thing. In terms of back to the day-to-day decision-making, one way to not have to force consensus is to really make each individual manager accountable and define what they're accountable for. And that's back to that earlier question. That actually creates your bench. As a leader, it's difficult for someone who's really a command and control type personality. It's very difficult for them to let go and let them do that. The natural tendency is to get into every detail. That actually doesn't scale in a big company. So allowing people to take those decisions without having to force them to ask around and almost consensus build at every step is something that's important to do. And I think your entire organization will be better off if you can define a set of objectives and parameters and let people just work within those parameters and trust them to do it. If people are ethically challenged, they really have no business in your organization. You've got to make the hard decision and move on. There's really zero tolerance to that. Having said that, in a global environment, value equations change. They're different by culture. You've got to be sensitive to that and allow the company to act in a manner that is very, very acceptable in whatever part of the world that they're acting. You can't impose US-based values if you want to be successful in Brazil or in India or in China. You won't be. That's not to say you have to tolerate any kind of unethical behavior that's unethical for everyone. There really is zero tolerance for that, and I think there really is there's no gray area. And in a public company context, when you certify the financial statements every 90 days, under penalty of going to jail, you better be clear that there is absolutely no gray area. If there is an ethical violation, and we have had some, that person is terminated immediately. No severance package, nothing, they're out the door. And that's very clear in everybody's contract. It's very clear. We have very clear ethics policies that people sign off on when they become employees. And if you violate it, you're out.
So it's the stick as opposed to the carrot?
I think if you need to provide incentive for people to be ethical, you got a real problem. I don't think it's a stick. I think it's table stakes. Ethics is nothing more than common sense. It's the way people want to treat each other outside of the job as well. I don't see why, if you treat your neighbors with respect and dignity, why would you not do that at the office? If you're not going to cheat your friends outside the office, why would you cheat your customers or your suppliers in the office? It's the same value system. You got to be consistent. If it's not consistent, then there's no room for you. Right now, I personally spend between 30 and 50% of my time directly interfacing with customers. So traveling to customers, talking to, and the engagements I have are typically, with kind of CTO level, where are they headed? Where's their business going? It's not necessarily the nitty-gritty details of the network. Where's their business going? How can we, Tech-Elect, help them get to where they want to be? So I'd say 30 to 50% of the time. 10 to 20% is spent on investor issues, whether it's compliance, reviewing the Qs and Ks and doing all of that, doing the investor presentations, investor calls. And then the balance would be what I call operations. And the operations part, I really pick and choose what I need to do depending on where we think the weaknesses are as a team. If there's a group that's running very, very well and doesn't need a lot of involvement, my asking for a one-day review is just holding everybody up. So what I typically just get is kind of the weekly updates from each of the functional areas, and if I've got any questions on those updates, I ask. If I don't, we move on. So it's not one of those kind of command and control for the rest of the 30%. So that's roughly how I spend my personal time. And then overarching all that, it's really people issues. If I had to pick a common theme on all those issues I just talked about, whether it's with customers or whether it's with operations, it always comes down to a particular issue that involves an individual. This particular customer, we can't break through this individual who thinks that blah, 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 and then you try to work a plan to convince that individual to do something. Or in operations, we're not doing this very well in this particular group. Well, it typically is because the management team is weak in that particular functional area, and you've got to do something about it. It's amazing how almost every issue comes back to dealing with a people issue of one kind or another. Thank you.